mention that came up was that often the consequences of finding epidemiological data that suggest problems, there's an expectation that the tribe will change the way its operations and its policies and procedures in order to be eligible for money or support to follow through on the recommended action. So it's almost as though if you allow someone, if you're in a tribal leadership, if you allow someone to start collecting data, you can see down the pathway that there'll be a request for doing things differently in order to qualify for money. Certainly this is true for in the juvenile and youth services. So that's another issue of, is the data collected going to lead to a proposal that will expect the tribe to change the way that it operates, especially legislatively and with its policies?
Yeah, those are some really, really great points, Jerry. Thanks for bringing those up. And I think that Shelley, in her presentation today, is going to kind of hit on, touch on almost everything that's been brought up in at least some way, shape, or form. And so with that said, I would like to introduce our speaker today. For those of you who haven't met her, Shelley is the tribal liaison at the Office of Behavioral Health in the Colorado Department of Human Services. And she's going to give a presentation today on American Indian and Alaska Native populations and data. And Shelley, if you would like to share your screen, you should be able to. Oh, Shelley, I think you're on mute.
There you go. Thank you. So I had sent it to Sydney because if I'm on travel, so if I share my screen, I just have the laptop. I can't see any of the notes or anything if I do presentation style. So thank you. That's so awesome. Now, the problem, of course, is that I might jump ahead of wherever you guys are. So hopefully I'm kind of known for that sort of thing. So I'm difficult to predict, you know what I'm saying? So hello, everyone. My name is Shelley Solopow, and I'm the tribal liaison for the Office of Behavioral Health. And I just kind of want to say briefly that the tribal liaison, I guess I should finish the intro first. I'm Little Shell, Chippewa from Montana, a tribe that was the most recent tribe to be federally recognized just last year. So for those of you that know what that means, woohoo, and that's awesome. So I wanted to go ahead and start off with a disclaimer and let people know that at the level of SEOW, there may very well be people with lots of epidemiological background and training and knowledge, and that is not my background. So I do have a master's in community, I guess, mental health. So community counseling. So, and then the LPC, and then working in the field for many years and so forth. An interest in data has just always been there for me. And I think it's from having other family members that have always been in public health. So if I say things or you know, you're like, gosh, she's really not interpreting that correctly or whatever, just kind of roll with it and forgive me, because I don't have sort of the higher level knowledge of some of the data information that some of you have. I'm not even sure quite how to put it. So consider me sort of like a self learner that likes to sound like she knows. So what I'm going to do is, for some of you, it sounds like this might be review, and for other of you, maybe it wouldn't be. I hope not. These are the major issues and considerations. There are many, many more and many more in depth. So we're just going to roll with it and see where we go. And so that's that. So background. So let's go ahead with background. So one of the things, if you really want to understand about data and American Indian, Alaska Native people, and I'm not always going to say Native American, just so you guys know. You really have to understand something about federal Indian policy. It doesn't mean that you would have to be an expert, but federal Indian policy really refers to the formal relationship and approach that the United States government, prior to even being nation building, and through today, their approach to Indigenous people in these lands can be labeled this way. And sometimes that's a formal approach and sometimes it's not, but most of the time it is. And there'll be a period of time that has sort of been labeled historically, like this was the official approach of the people prior to forming the US government and then after. And so I am not going to bore everybody with a whole lot of history because it's extremely complex. But I have just sort of broke it down. So you're talking about pre-colonial nations that arrived, or people who represented nations that arrived, really treated a very large population with the idea that they lived here and had some sense of ownership and nationhood in their own way. And then after the point of beginning colonization, you really see the whole process of colonization taking place. There were treaties for quite some time, but it's complex. So rather than go into all that, I'm just going to say there's what's known as a treaty period, a time before and a time after. Removal is really, you know what? I'm going to skip that part because it's confusing. But let's just say that when there's periods of removal, this one is the one that's marked historically, like, hey, this is a removal period. Maybe I won't skip it, but it's really about pushing people over, okay? And anytime you have expansion or gold rush times, you have a period of removal that'll re-pop up. So it can be confusing for people. Then you have this sense of allotment. Well, let's assimilate. Let's give allotments. That sounds really awesome to give an allotment of land, but really, if it's someone else's land, it's not, you're really helping by giving an allotment. And it also has a lot to do with putting things in so-called trust. And then it involves things such as boarding schools and whatnot. And then you would have to like prove that you were fit to ever get that land that's still held in trust, actually. So then we have a reorganization period, which was interesting because sort of like the New Deal type thing. It was a really interesting time. They decided that some of those schools and some of that those practices were horrifying. And then termination, that's when we decided there weren't going to be tribes or reservations or whatever. And by we, I just mean United States. And then this defining period of self-determination. And when all else didn't work, it feels like people started to go back to, why don't we let tribal populations decide for themselves? So that started the idea of those promises for healthcare and all that sort of thing are still there. It's not that those treaties are gotten rid of or the responsibility's gone. It's moving toward, we have this money, we're gonna, it's not enough or whatever, but instead of just giving it to IHS, here's the path to where you can provide your healthcare, that sort of thing. I just kind of want to briefly show, there's so many different ways to talk about, but here's just a little poster there. I moved on to slide 4, relocation, and you kind of see what the Denver poster looked like. I'm not sure if y'all have seen that before. But the idea was, hey, come to the cities. Oftentimes there'd be these great ideas when it comes to, at least they thought they were great when it comes to policy, but they weren't funded. And you still see that in legislation when it comes to healthcare and so forth. There's, you have to do this, you have to do that. But then the parts that are not ratified or not put, I don't know if that's the right word, but they're not funded, basically. So then it becomes very difficult to meet those promises. Really gold rush, you'll see the most aggressive policies toward getting people to assimilate or just flat out removing them. And that's part of this process here. So the next slide. Here is an example of what's called Hiawatha Indian Insane Asylum, which I believe 1890 something was sort of like put through, and then it started in like 1902-ish. More than 370 Native people were placed there. I believe most of them died. I'm not really sure how many died because they don't really, it's not that easy to find. And so many people were buried various places. And I know you're all hearing about boarding schools now, but this is one way that the information out there on what's occurred is hidden. So you can't really just look up a list of Canton, South Dakota insane asylum, where in fact there are, if you look into it, there are many a quote back in the day where people were saying, you know, gosh, it doesn't seem like that people are getting any mental health there or are insane. And it's just sort of sad because, you know, there's a lot of abuses because there's, you know, people buried with very small babies and children. It's like, you know, they would have had to have become pregnant there, that kind of thing. So it's just not the best part of our history. And let's see. The other issue with that is that it benefited greatly, especially if you had matriarchal system, to have a person deemed not fit. It benefited the people of that area because that land became available. So you would have to like either prove that you were capable to get it back, or sometimes that wasn't even an option. Okay, so this brings us to, and that might, let me just stop here for a second. That might not seem related to data, but it really is, because it's a long history of hiding what's real and what's true and delivering information that is in fact what the people that were doing it want to present. Okay, so this next slide, when we talk about cultural humility, I think we should just like take a pause, because discussing things like putting people in asylums that aren't ill and boarding schools can be very disturbing. So I literally would like, even though I can't hear you all, to everyone to sort of take a breath. And exhale. And then one more time. I'm totally breathing from my chest. I'm aware of that now that I stopped to do the breath. The presenter is the one who needs the breath. So when we talk about cultural humility, I know it sort of became like a buzzword, but or buzzwords, but really, I think the point is that we're looking at understanding this situation and understanding others in a different way. Openness, curiosity, and basically what has been an assumption of superiority that I know this can make some people uncomfortable to talk about this, and I understand that, but this is sort of how we're brought up and educated. And so it makes some of these crimes at the time seem okay and justified, but really it's still built into the systems, the scientific systems, the idea of superiority. So when we talk about cultural humility, it actually has quite a bit of implications, because it's easy to see overt attempts to dismantle family, culture. Those you can see, right? For some reason, seems like people can see them better right now, but there are covert ways to do that as well. But cultural humility starts the path of sort of like dismantling that idea. Okay, so qualitative and ethical issues. This leads us to basically the concept of structural humility. And the reason I put that in there is it's not just popular to talk about right now. It's also important, or we won't be able to do what we're supposed to do. For example, if I am working for the state of Colorado, I'm really part of the system. And I'm part of the system that the governor has decided, you know, it's my responsibility to sort of dismantle systemic racism wherever I see it, right? If I haven't learned about the systems and where they are and where it's built in, I won't be able to see these covert issues, right? So when I look at, say, Western models of theory, assessment, design, measures, and then finally implications for practice and interventions that are designed, those are all based on, for example, individualism and autonomy, and that is the assumption that that is better, and that's going to affect pretty much everything in my approach to people that don't have that same system of belief. And so if I'm within this system in the state, it's gonna be very hard for me to see when that's occurring and when it's not advantageous. So I gotta really work on my structural humility, and I do it every day. I try to work on it every single day, and this is part of that. So then slide 8, we're kind of looking at a very obvious picture of the difference between the focus on individualism and autonomy. And remember that I chose aspen trees for a reason, and that is that not unlike a lot of other trees, the root system itself creates one organism. So we think about a forest, you're really talking about one system. So if I say there's something wrong with that tree over there, and I'm not looking at the forest as a whole, I'm probably not going to fix the tree. It's just going to go to everyone. So it's not so the best example I can come on is suicide prevention. It's sort of like the thing that bothers me the most. What has been useful for American Indian and Alaska Native people with suicide prevention? Not much. We intervene based on this individual, what is wrong with this kid. And it's not, and I'm just choosing to talk about adolescents versus adults. It's not what is wrong with the school, what isn't working, or what is right with this family or this kid and that person's skills and that community. So we're not looking at positive and historically speaking, and we're not looking at systems. And so basically Western models have failed for decades to alter the trajectory of increasing suicide rates for Native people, just flat out. Canada, the US, and if anything, it's just continued to rise, and then how fast it's rising has actually gone up. So the other thing I kind of wanted to point to, oh, by the way, can I pause just for a second? It's super weird having everybody muted, but I understand it's because it's a large group. But if you guys have anything you want to, like, I can't see the comments. So if there's, I don't know if the people that are running the meeting want to change it, but it doesn't bother me at all if people aren't muted. So, because then they can pop in or whatever.
Yeah, we haven't had any questions come up in the chat, but I will monitor that for you, Shelley. But it sounds like you're inviting folks to jump in if they have questions as
just,
we go.
You know, or just here, you know, whatever you want to say, that's fine. It's just, I feel like I'm talking into a hole, but anyway, that's really not your problem. So one of the questions you were asking in the little breakout rooms, if I understand correctly, was about sovereignty issues. And it's really so important. Big issues, it's an uninformed view of sovereignty. And then if you don't have the cultural humility piece, the problems just multiply. I mean, it just goes exponential from there. So just briefly, understanding that the people on this call probably know this. If you tribes are sovereign entities, and sovereignty, if you look it up in terms of American Indians, you might find more than one definition, and some will be very much legal definitions that follow the United States government understanding of what sovereignty is for tribal people in this area. That is not what sovereignty means. A cultural or structural humility approach would tell you that sovereignty is inherent in people who are organized and have a system and culture of belief and have lived here for immemorial time, right? So it is not and cannot be granted by other people or other institutions. So those definitions alone that you will find that differ, they tend to look like, oh, this is the social justice perspective and this is not. I don't know if that's really true. I really think this is what it is with some sort of humility, and this is what it is without. That's kind of how I'm seeing it. So I check with myself and I check with others by saying, well, what would you do with France? How would you speak to France about it? And not just because French people have these sort of like stereotypical, like uppity sort of, it's also because it usually like goes, oh, whoa, wait a minute. No, I wouldn't just assume that, I forget his name right now, that I could just, Macron, that I could just walk up to Macron and go like, hey, let's talk about data, you know, that I would be jumping so many steps, right? So I'm not just going to go to chairman and go, let's talk about data, because that's not my role. It's a government to government role, and there should be a leadership approach in that way. So I'm out of my depth. And I think it's important that we know that. So the other piece of this, this one slide here, is really historically this idea that experts are people who have many, many years of schooling, and that if your community has problems, you really should be thankful that experts want to come in and study. And so we don't actually overtly say that anymore, but it's still in the system that there's a supremacy feeling. So if we go in with the understanding that knowledge gained from science is inherently better than other kinds of knowledge, that might be what we're taught when we're trying to determine like scientific evidence for something, but that doesn't make it true. So if we just step back and go, okay, I built my whole college career on this and my whole career on this in epidemiology, but that doesn't make it true. Oh, come on. No, it doesn't. So if you ask elders, they'll tell you that they have had knowledge of what's in people's hair for however long. Oh, it's all your ancestors and all the people, and then everything that's ever happened to you, and not just that, but what you're doing right now. Well, it turns out DNA really does have all of those. So the fact that they're having this verbally and not written, and that it came from this sort of like divine knowledge, that doesn't make it less valid than scientific knowledge. We just have the less of an expert approach. I think the rest will come. It's like you don't have to write down like, okay, this is everything that's wrong with this approach. When you approach it from a humble point of view, those things flow more naturally. And it's not easy, because that means you have to invite people to the table in early planning. And this is something that if Christine Velez was on, she could talk about that in a recent contract we had, where she did a study of feasibility. And of course, COVID got in the way of tribal council being able to participate from the design phase, but that was the plan from the design phase. I know some of you are probably aware of those public health models now that allow for that. It's not easy. One qualitative study that's really interesting that y'all, it's not in my notes or anything, that you might look up, is Seeking Safety. And that's been around forever, the dual diagnosis approach. And it's to substance use and trauma, PTSD. They did a First Nation study, and it talks about the difficulty that the folks that, specialize in design and of studies that are trying to demonstrate efficacy and whatnot, trying to get them to meet with tribal people and First Nations people and talk about their understanding of how knowledge is gained and whatnot. So yeah, it's just a great qualitative study to read, to really see what that looked like, the time involved, and just all of that. Just wonderful. So the whole decolonizing data, I think, might start with really the self of the person doing it, the expert, so-called expert. Okay. Let's see, let's move on to 10. I think I basically covered this in my babble just a second ago. So when I said, I think I covered lack of involvement in design and planning. Lack of ownership of data is a huge one. It's still happening now. If it's about me, then isn't it mine? And also there's been a history of no recognition of value of certain things. So just because it isn't sacred to you doesn't mean it isn't to someone else. So I think recently I was on a website, I think it's out of Anshut, so some of you should be pretty familiar with it. And when you answer, it's about like DNA, and when you answer that you identify as Native, you go through this other process, and they ask you all sorts of things. And basically there's a whole different set of criteria because we're talking about physiological sample, right? So they have to contact your people because it's theirs, it's yours, but it's also your people. And so anything that comes from that is also belongs to them. They're taking your biological samples as sacred, which is new. I don't know of any other situation where I've been asked those things in a study, and I don't know if you guys know of any other designs like that, but it was really an eye-opener. I found it fascinating. And then even if people were not, they didn't say, well, only if you're federally recognized can you say, they'll say like, oh, you think you're Hiawatha or whatever. So, well, actually that's a language. So you think you're, some sort of not recognized, I don't know. They still ask, well, where are the people that where you're from? And so like, let's say they had your sample and you were to, pass away or something, they would still contact those people to find out what they wanted to do and follow those procedures. So, with your samples. So I think that's really the step in the right direction. Okay. So the focus on the negative, some of you probably are aware of this. It grabs headlines and whatnot. And there are times when that makes perfect sense. The interns at the CDC, they came up with the idea that actually, if you break down the suicide rates by age, you'll see the striking difference between American Indians, Alaska Natives, and this age group and others. But if you put them together, then it'll just look like it's sort of worse. But if you break it into these age groups and do the math accordingly, wow, you have a massive difference. So those are situations where, of course, you have to report what's true and what you found, but there are just years and years and years and years of studies that just alcohol alone, as an example, articles in scientific journals really, this is the long-term problem of blah, blah, blah. It's actually a socio-cultural problem of colonization, but that's not what's written. So we have to be very careful. Do we lead with this? Because we don't want to contribute to ongoing stereotypes and the lack of focus on resilience that has, not been helpful, really, when it comes to intervention. So yeah, data on the negative, very important to review. Okay, I'm on to 11. We're on practical problems. For those of you who are wondering where we are, we're on part 2. This is really more about the real stuff, right? And I realize that there are very, very many more practical problems than what I'm going to talk about or what I'm going to touch on. So feel free to, jot your own notes or mention things in the comments that you think are important. Because you don't necessarily know that other people on the call already know about it. So it used to be quite the process to get census data for specific areas and estimated data for areas for American Indians and Alaska Natives alone or in combination with one or more other races. And for places like Colorado, that's extremely important because, we have many more people that are going to identify as having 2 or more races that are American Indians. So what you have, though, historically in our state is only published information on what the CDC would have called American Indian only. And there was a time, of course, when you couldn't even indicate multiple races when it came to the census. And the census will also ask like what tribe. So if people feel like, well, I'm not recognized, I can't write what tribe, they would not claim it or whatever. But now it just seems like it's easier and makes more sense. And so people that identify that way are more likely to select that. And it also over the decades became less stigma involved, and it became not something you would hide necessarily. That granted, there are still people who identify as Native that don't really have anything but a family story. I don't really have the same opinion that a lot of Native people on that do, that they get offended by that. And I understand that, but I don't think it's as big a problem as some folks do when it comes to census data. So I would much rather have it be an inclusive process because of colonization itself. So we're looking at more than 200,000 people now in Colorado, which I've been telling people for a long time, but that doesn't mean that anyone really believed me. But I don't know necessarily if all those people, those 200,000 people, all technically qualify, for instance, for healthcare under IHS guidelines. But the point is, people are identifying that way. And so to say, for instance, the Commission of Indian Affairs website used to say there were 50,000 American Indians identifying as American Indian alone in the state of Colorado. And so that would give like a very different picture of the population. And you will see that it's much closer to 3 to 4% and not less than 1%, as has been indicated in the past. So really want in some counties. So we really want to look at that and consider that really there aren't many other races or other ethnic groups that have to have that stigma of demonstrating who you are or where you came from in order to claim how you identify. So big differences probably for funding. One situation to consider for us in like just in school systems, a lot of times school system data is entered by a clerk that is in the front room of an elementary school. She or he might not have any education in the area of racial or ethnic identity, and they may not be comfortable asking these questions. So a lot of times if, there's a family in front of me and I'm registering them, and I've worked in school systems, so I'm not just making this up. And their last name is Alvarez, and they seem to have sort of dark skin or medium skin, and I'm going to check Hispanic. And so the problem, of course, with that is that might not be the case, or it could be that they are or aren't Hispanic and also other things. So by not asking, the estimates in schools are largely under the estimates within the census. So we want to kind of look at that and go, when something's less than half, what does it mean? How accurate are we, and which is inaccurate? And I just caution that we don't assume that the inaccurate number is the higher one. And that has historically been what we've done. That is a misunderstanding based on stereotypes and the thought process that there aren't a lot of American Indians around. And it's just not true. So we You have to look at that. Don't disregard the numbers that seem too high. Let's look at disregarding the numbers that seem too low, or at least when they're not matching. Let's look at that. For those who don't know, I'm on 11. The other issue I kind of want to touch on is just identity alone. So this creates a problem when it comes to numerator not matching denominator, okay? So it sounds super easy that those would match, but when it comes to Indian labels, that's very difficult. So the IHS, the Indian Health Service, is going to have a label that changes, but it usually is in federal statute. So over time, you've seen it become a little bit more liberal, but I still have to prove what my father's enrollment is. So that was helped a lot last year with recognition. But for my children to go to IHS, I have to have that. So there are people who identify as American Indian, though, and who you would see and go, oh, that fits my stereotype of American Indian. They're dancing and they're winning at powwow, and oh my gosh, that can't qualify for these services. So it's really very complex. And it's really the only group I can think of other than veterans that would have to prove anything to go get the health care that they're promised. Now, the IRS understanding of what makes American Indians and Alaska Natives is also different, because I would have to have, for them to care, I would have to sort of be registered living in a reservation area where I'm not, where my tax law is different, okay? The state of Colorado is going to have a different definition when I'm looking to sign up for, say, Medicaid. And then the Affordable Care Act has yet a different definition. So I'm required to prove XYZ. I cannot use my eligibility for IHS to count for that, but I should be able to get that waiver so that I don't have to pay, like, let's say I qualified for Medicaid, so I don't have to pay like the fees and copays because I'm technically an Indian. But as long as the federal government and the ACA don't see that the same way, and then the state of Colorado also differs, there's going to be a lot of gap there. So you can see how identity will change based on what other people are saying, but also will affect how that individual sees themselves, whether they'll claim Indianness or not. Having the numerator and denominator be the same in statewide data, with just an example of those four entities having the different qualifications to call yourself that, it can become a nightmare. So yeah, that's something to consider, whether you're looking at suicide data, healthy kids data, you know, any of it. Okay, so census, I want to keep also in mind, census is vastly improved. I'm on slide 12. Who can guess this last year, 2020? There was a record number, and it was all very exciting, of Ute Mountain Ute tribal members that participated in the census. Can anyone give me an estimate of the percentage? Hopefully they're not showing you the answer. Should I look in the chat? 0.5. Oh, you guys, you're so funny. So the record number, record high of a representation in the census for Ute Mountain Ute. So you guys, 0.5, 80. Okay, so 40% in 2020, which is an all-time high. So when you're looking at census data for that area, remember that most of the American Indians that are listed there, yes, I did. Jack Reed, I don't think I was very clear. I just said record number and kept repeating it, and then you're supposed to read my mind. So yeah, sorry about that. It wasn't very clear when I read the question. I thought you were just like being like, yeah, you can't get those people to, you know, do the census. Yeah. So yeah, that's why I was joking or laughing around about it. So when you're looking at that data, consider, number one, the reality is there are more American Indians in Montezuma County that live outside the reservation. However, are there 7 times more that live outside, you know, or is it more like 50-50 or 60-40? It's going to be off. if you've got a 40% representation of tribally affiliated people from the reservation. And it'll look like it jumped, of course, from last time. It'll look like it jumped up, but that may not, in fact, be the case at all. There's also, you're going to find a lot of numbers in the state are based on Medicaid. And Medicaid data has one issue that's a pretty big problem, and that is it's not their fault or anything. I'm not suggesting that HICPUF has some sort of liability in this, but what I am saying is, of all the ethnic and racial groups, well, I can't really say that actually, because folks that don't have status as citizens or whatever may have a higher number of not being enrolled. But right now, American Indians and Alaska Natives really have the lowest enrollment rate nationwide, but also in Colorado as far as eligible people that are not enrolled. So there are pockets in the state where that's very exaggerated. I don't mean exaggerated, I mean it's amplified. So let's say in a given area, I'm just going to be more vague, a specific area, there might be 900 to 1,200 people that are American Indian identified that qualify for Medicaid, and there might be like 10% in that area that are enrolled. So if you're using Medicaid data, it's not always identified when you're looking through systems and trying to find numbers. But you really need to know that to know, wait a minute, if I'm getting 10% of something, is that valid? And is it quite possible that there's something systematically different about this 10% also? So we really want to look at that and make sure, because you don't always have awareness of that with people. Okay, so these are some things that slide 13 that I really kind of want to stop and think about because of the published studies. So when you include Hispanic as an ethnicity, there's some issues that come up that are peculiar. It's not that Chicano isn't a thing. It's not that people aren't indigenous, or that there aren't indigenous people that are also Latinx or Hispanic. It's that simply including that in your numbers will adversely affect one group of people in the data, and not others. So I have some articles I'm gonna send, and then people can look at some. You all may be familiar with it already. God, what was it called? It had a really popular name. But there's been more than one discussion of it, but I think the original study was really very interesting. Unequal treatment or something like that. Do you guys remember what that was? A big article some years back that affected like the OMB stuff, and then resulted in some recommendations of how to keep that from occurring. And I don't know if we really have time with the delay on my computer and everything, but if you were to go to the Colorado Suicide dashboard, and there's really, it's not as dramatic if you just go to age adjusted and do this. So I would actually recommend you go into the crude numbers and just start control and clicking on, I'd say, the youngest 3 age groups, and select American Indian. And then when you're all set and you're looking at it, then at the final round, go ahead and select non-Hispanic. And you will see, not only does the sample size go to like virtually nothing, you will see such a dramatic change in what is presented there as the highest risk groups. And the highest risk groups is not different in Colorado, as we would be led to believe as other states, in that American Indian, Alaska Native, younger folks, meaning like 28 and lower, are really the highest risk groups. And they are here just as they are many places throughout the United States. So if you have this data year after year that doesn't seem to match other states, we need to look into it. And one of the reasons why it hasn't matched is this issue with Hispanic versus non-Hispanic. And it's, again, I'm not saying that there are non-Hispanic American Indians. Obviously there are. Whether people identify or whether it's self-selected, whether it's not, it's really, that really doesn't matter to me. It's there. The point is, it's also there that it only adversely affects one group. So if you're looking at a report and you've got white folks, folks listed as Black, and they all have both Hispanic and non-Hispanic numbers reported, why don't the American Indians have that as well? And I understand there's some identification issues with, like, well, if there's only 3 people in an area, it's not that there's only 3 people, it's that we've been that bad at gathering information on American Indians. Even in, I can't even think of a county where there's only 3, I don't know, somewhere in the Northeast. But so that's something to really consider. And like I say, there's quite a bit of, there's published information on that. So it's not just Shelley's pet peeve or anything. If you play around with that dashboard, you will really see what I'm talking about. Keeping in mind, of course, that the overall number count is extremely low because they're using a lot of American Indian only. So, and the numerators aren't matching denominators and all sorts of other stuff, but much improved recently, actually. So that's great. And I'm pretty sure it is also like national data. So like, yeah. So the other issue with suicide data, of course, and lots of other data is, or am I saying that right? I think I left it singular. So sorry, all you scientists, so sorry. I'll just say numbers, lots of other numbers, is the under-identification in death. Oh, and how I spell Washington, let's see. Washington, yeah. Okay, so all of you smarties, oh, I did put the numbers. So between 30 to 50%, it depends on what studies you're reading, what area you're in, whether, you know, that state has done anything to sort of like address some of these concerns. So there's so many different variables involved. I think when it comes to suicide data in Colorado, it's probably higher than a 50% under identification. But that is probably because of the very, very high percentage of urban or American Indians that do not live on the reservation land. We haven't really taken all the necessary steps to design data gathering for that unique situation. Not all states have that. And yes, I know that more Native people live in urban areas now, but even the state of Washington, for instance, with like 27 or 29 recognized tribes and whatnot, we're not dealing with that situation. Even though they have a lot of Native people in Seattle, we're dealing with far more of a percentage outside of the land that is currently owned, or I'm sorry, not owned, currently housing or whatever reserved for Ute, Mountain Ute, and Southern Ute. We're talking about like 90%. It's a huge, huge difference. And if we don't do anything to sort of capture that or build in that issue, then remember, these data systems are not built to capture that ratio. They're just not. So there's also data explaining, or I should say studies explaining, oh, I'm so sorry about that sentence that just sort of trails off about Portland area. Just forgive me. Just Washington State study. So what it was is the urban, or NICUI, the Urban Indian Health Board, really looked at, I'm going to cross-reference these this death in, you know, what, I can't remember what the data set was, if it was dying from opiate overdose, or I can't remember what it was, but and then when they correct the numbers, of course, it's just ridiculously high for American Indians. So when you're looking at, I think, the opioid overdose rate for, I don't know if it was 2017, it's right when I started, and there was like number sets that showed overdose rates, and American Indians were highest, like 3 out of 4 of the data sets that were there. And what I want to suggest is that that's not the case. What I want to suggest is that they're in fact the highest and most at risk for overdose of any group because of the under-identification. So even in my own life, being there when my own father passed away and being asked for his tribal card, and so they wrote down Caucasian. So I was just like, okay, I'm telling you he's not, but I couldn't prove it right then. So I would have to go back, pay money, and have it altered when I can prove that. So we're talking about basically everyone who doesn't die with long black hair and braids. Are they really going to be indicated that way? Probably not. Okay, so I'm taking another little break. Does that make it anybody jump up with questions or any concerns about some of this stuff? Because I kind of went through a ton just now. I guess I should check the chat. It takes like a half an hour. Oh, only 10 minutes. Oh, crap. Okay, thanks, Sydney. Tribal epidemiology centers. So tribal epidemiology centers have similar like HIPAA rights and so forth as public health institutes otherwise. So a lot of times people don't realize that. Albuquerque area would be the epidemiology centers for Ute Mountain Ute, Southern Ute, and curiously for Denver Indian Health and Family Services, right? However, if you're not using their computer system that's free, you're really not, the TEC isn't really getting your data. So for Denver Indian Health and Family Services, I don't think the Tribal Epidemiology Center is getting that unless they're reporting it separately outside of that system. So we can't absolutely count on IHS data for Colorado to be 100% accurate, considering that the 2 tribal areas that are reporting are definitely not representative of all natives in the state. So consider that with the health data. Agreements, we've really only just begun with that, but the TECs have agreements started with tribes. So they're very good in my estimation in the short conversations I've had at respecting that what is information about tribal people belongs to them. And so their MOUs or agreements or whatever it is that they have definitely recognize that, and they've gone through those discussions. That's something that I think Colorado is only just beginning, and you really have to build trust to go there. I think it's pretty expected to lack trust in institutions. So we have to start from the beginning, I guess is what I'm trying to say there. I don't even know if we work with, you guys might know, if public health numbers overall work with the TECs or not. How to improve. So I just reviewed again this whole idea that we're responsible, and I know some of you aren't, but as state employees and public servants, to dismantle systemic racism. It wasn't that long ago when you really weren't allowed to talk about systemic racism at work much without people kind of getting really nervous. So this part of this, just so you know, is just Shelley's opinion. So I really think understanding structural competence is key. I think we have to look at experts' advice. So that's the information that I'm just about to email. And then recently, public health models that are community-based, and let me just go ahead and pull up her email if I can. They take longer to do, and you have to have qualitative, and you have to have interviews. Sometimes with tribes, you really have to have those key people, and even in the urban setting, if you're like, this came up with COVID, we were trying to work on a campaign, you know, how do we get this messaging out to get vaccinated or get tested or whatever. You know, what should that message be? How do we get it to the key people? We literally came up with some lists. Like, it sounds really strange, but there are just these folks in a community that are hubs. And you kind of have to get to know the community to know who those people are. And so then they have webs that go out and have a ton of influence. So that influence is still somewhat just word of mouth and talking, but it's also become social media presence as well. So really have to zone in on those key people and really ask them. And then, of course, from the movement of disabilities, the nothing about them without them has sort of been adopted by many folks in American Indian science communities and tribal communities. Like, please don't talk about us if we're not there. And that's hard to do in a liaison role sometimes, because I might have data and I might have information and might not have anyone on the line that's, that's representative of that group. So kind of got to tread lightly, but this to me makes perfect sense. And why would I have the same voice? I certainly am not representative of all people that identify as American Indian in Colorado. So just the respect alone of including people when you're speaking about them, I just think that we wouldn't have to necessarily remind ourselves of this if there wasn't that built-in sort of supremacy thing going on, because it's sort of dehumanizing. Okay, so let's see. Christine says use a mixed methods approach, quantitative, qualitative. I kind of said that, but not really. Urban Indian Health Institute, I'm going to send that in the email. And Native Nations Institute offers suggestions. I think I have a link also to a data sovereignty organization in the presentation somewhere. Data use agreements for tribe-specific data, that is so important, but I'm not, I think the key there is I'm not the person to start that conversation. That's kind of what I was talking about in small groups. You're talking about a government. So it has to go through the proper process if I want to make an agreement, which is most likely starting with the Colorado Commission of Indian Affairs. That's the organization you would probably go with to even get going on that agreement. Important county and local public health entities enhance communication. That's probably true. There's also a lot of social and historical issues happening, for instance, in Montezuma County. So you'd want to get the lowdown from people. You wouldn't want to, for instance, take the word of the group of county commissioners on what's happening in the tribal community in that county. So there's lots of places where COVID has exacerbated racial tensions. And it's you really need to have someone explain it and run down with you what that is, and before you. But yes, public health officials is not the same as county commissioners, but just be careful about that. And then education and outreach with public health officials or staff to mitigate misclassification. This really needs to be a statewide effort. So yeah, I'll send an article about that. In New Mexico, California, she says, is doing education campaign with coroners. I would love to do that. It's just outside of my scope, but I just think it would be wonderful to reduce our under-identification and death. She also talked about interviewees that they talked with that described upgrading electronic health records, training people in nearby, staff members, but also nearby areas, and implementing some sort of data quality check. Working with the text, we already talked about that, and then university programming. Those are really good points. So I know Christine's not on the call, but I thank her for those additions. And I'm going to see if I really think another thing that a lot of people don't do that's important is if you haven't talked to folks that are from the areas and you still have traditional people in the communities that practice traditional ways, you're probably not going to get information that's been interpreted correctly without the cultural point of view. So just consider that, and consider that in reviewing, like, for instance, data with the Ray. That's going to be interpreted in a certain way, or data with an MSO, or data with these other entities. It's already in a system that's created by people outside there. So what I'm trying to say is, if you leave out discussions with people from the culture and you only use this, you may miss some of the most important aspects of something. and I'm sorry I don't have an example that would drive that home, but just the differences in language alone. The other issue, of course, is that it's very difficult to show that something is evidence-based. And so when we say evidence-based, we really need to think about what that means to people who don't have the funds, the capacity to build an evidence base. We're just systematically excluding everybody that can't do that. So I cannot take something and say, well, it worked with Cherokee people, so it's going to work here. We don't know that that's true. It's completely different. It's not the same just because they're indigenous. So we have to be very, very careful with that, and not just expect people to use models that weren't created for them or that worked with other folks. And then I was just going to ask what you guys have done. You know, what have people done that they have found to be really helpful to approach some of these issues? I know that there's the Office of Minority, is it Office of Minority Health? They don't say minority anymore. Office of Health Equity. They have recommendations that are out there that I did not include in my email that I'm currently sending Sydney. So why don't we open it up now to like questions and whatnot? Comments, concerns, complaints. Can we unmute or? What is happening?
I put this in chat, but we have very similar issues with crime data, and especially when we're looking at crime victimization across the state, because it's a, you know, there's an Office of Victims Programs, and when they're looking at how to do allocation, it can be very, very hard to identify, especially the tribal populations that really do need the victim services, just because it can be difficult to identify what's happening in those areas. As a state, it can be hard.
Oh, absolutely. I completely agree. So in the chat, what is the thing that you do?
To improve it, or to,
Yeah.
you know, it's difficult in part because, you know, it's like you said with data, right? How do we go and raise the issue without seeming like, you know, we're bringing it up, right? And so that kind of like letting them lead, but we still have to be, you know, present, which is, you know, just in and of itself, pointing out that there might be an issue. And so, you know, it's a difficult, I think, place for our victims unit to deal with as well, and for, you know, criminal justice data overall.
Oh, absolutely. What a mess that is too, because you have a BIA, you have some federal, some not, some differences in law governing where things happen, right? I mean, don't you have like multiple jurisdictions that play hot potato sometimes with things?
Yeah, I mean, and it's like the specifics of where it happens just completely changes who's going to be able to report and whether that ends up in our data or not.
And I was surprised. I was reading something that if I were to be, for instance, ticketed or something on when I'm on the reservation, I would have different rules around me as a person considered Indian in general than if someone else was pulled over or whatever, which I thought was just fascinating. Of all the stuff that I just sent Sydney, I want to point out a specific article of recommendations by, I believe it's the Urban Indian. It's called Best Practices American Indian Data Collection, I believe. And I just want people to make sure they look at that and read very carefully. A lot of times people read that and they just pay attention to the first part of the sentence. It talks a lot in a little bit different wording about what I was talking about, numerator, denominator. If you cannot make sure that your numerator, denominator are talking about the same types of groups, that's when you go to AI, AN only, but you don't just do that in general. What they're saying is you classify it that way in your collection, not necessarily just reporting out. So read that carefully, because that is a huge misunderstanding that's often made when people are reading those recommendations. If you cannot guarantee that you have multi-racial information in your Indian only, then you need to adjust what you're doing with that. Okay, other people, questions, concerns? I just sent an email that had most of the articles.
Yeah, Shelley, I just got your email and I will be sending that out to everyone a little bit later this afternoon.
Awesome, thank you. More questions? I can't believe there's no more questions. Is it because of the time?
So first off, go ahead.
Jessica looks like her hand is raised.
Oh, I can't. Okay, let me see. Let me see if I can change my view. Whose hand? Let's call on whoever's hand is raised. I don't know who that is.
Jessica, did you have a question?
Sorry, that was the clap icon, not the hand raised.
Oh.
So I just want to say thank you, Shelley, a lot for sharing all of this. I'm sure you could continue to talk about this topic. Kind of wrap this discussion by breaking out back into our small groups, because we recognize that sometimes sharing thoughts or asking questions in this kind of very large group format can be a little bit more intimidating. And so we wanted to just return to those small groups that you were in at the beginning of this session to kind of spend 10 minutes reflecting on this presentation, your initial reactions, if your understanding of any of the issues that were talked about today has changed in the past hour or so. So Sydney, do you mind sending us back out into our groups? I hope that everybody had as fruitful a discussion as my group had, and in reflecting on some of the topics that were brought up and spaces for growth and continued learning. I know that Sydney will be compiling all of the resources that that Shelley shared and her additional resources that she put together to email over to Sydney. We'll be sharing those out. These are another 3 kind of resources, one of which Shelley had mentioned and linked to in her talk, which is actually the bottom one, which is the US Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network, which has some really great resources on defining sovereignty, not just from the US perspective, but they've also pulled material from Native peoples in New Zealand and Australia and other another 2 resources linked to here are the National Congress of American Indians Policy Research Center. And this center is really focused to work with such leaders with the best available knowledge to promote a framework that really includes Native wisdom to benefit Native peoples. And so some of the work that research center is currently doing includes working with the Census Information Center in processing the results of the 2020 census and sharing out that data, looking at tribal data capacity and increasing the capacity of Native tribes to produce, handle, and take ownership of their own data and put it to use for their own best practices. And then they also have recently been directing the Culture Science and Bioethics Core, which Shelley touched on a little bit in terms of, when now with the proliferation of like personal DNA testing and other pieces, like how to handle that data. I also wanted to highlight the Collaboratory for Indigenous Data Governance. And this is a group that is based at the University of Arizona, but also collaborates with Colorado State University's Forest and Rangeland Stewardship Program. And this is a group of individuals who are focused on all aspects of research, policy, and practice for Indigenous data sovereignty in public health, behavioral health, environmental science issues. And their website, which we've linked to here, also offers a lot of recorded webinars and policy briefs. So these are just a few more resources where individuals can turn to if you're interested in pursuing this topic further. On that note, again, a big thank you to Shelley for sharing your own expertise, wisdom, and knowledge with us today. We really appreciate you being here. I'm going to turn things over to Sydney to talk about some SEOW steering committee updates and the next steps in that group's work with the SEOW in general.
Thanks, Shana, and I do apologize. I'm getting an unstable internet notification, so if I break up, I'm sorry. The steering committee is conducting a needs assessment right now. We're looking at current data utilization and needs and gaps there in between. So we will be asking for input from SEOW members. That survey should be coming out in the near future. So just keep an eye on that. We do appreciate any feedback that you guys have to offer. And some of you may recall the last needs assessment back in 2018 was pretty fruitful. That's where the data literacy training manual came from and a few other publications that we have put out over the last couple of years. So this needs assessment will be used to inform future products. So that is why we would appreciate your feedback. So keep an eye on that. I'll be sending it out to folks shortly. And that's all.
Thanks, Sydney. For those of you who have been coming to SEOW meetings for a while, this is usually the space where we also have work group updates, but all of our work groups are currently pending the completion of this needs assessment and the work that comes out of it to think about what work groups we might be continuing or restarting or creating a new, depending on the direction of the work following the needs assessment. And so to wrap things up today, I just wanted to open up this space right now for any SEOW member news or announcements. If you have knowledge of any upcoming conferences or trainings that might be of interest to the group, reports or data findings or presentations coming up, please feel free to unmute yourself and share now. All right, so I'm going to take the silence as a sign that nobody has anything to share right now. If you do think of something after this meeting is over, you are always welcome to reach out to either Sydney or myself, and we will disseminate it to the members of the listserv, put it in the newsletters as they come out. And otherwise, we will see everybody at the next SEOW meeting, which will be on November 18th. And appreciate everybody being here today. So thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of your Thursday.